Hello and welcome to another audio podcast from Ensono, an ideal way to catch up with ideas, thoughts and reflections on some of the big issues facing IT professionals today. In this edition, we'll be sharing thoughts on some of the best ways for IT departments to build a business case and proposition for senior stakeholders in a business. What kind of business case is an IT team likely to present and why? How do you go about convincing a board to invest, and what strategies might work on getting around blockers? To answer these questions and many more, joining me in the studio today is Simon Ratcliffe, Principal Consultant at Ensono. We're also joined by a man with first-hand experience and knowledge of the topics we'll be discussing, Alan Crawford, Chief Information Officer at City and Guilds Group. Welcome, gentlemen. Alan, there must be very few listeners out there who haven't heard of City and Guilds Group, but just in case, in a few short words, can you tell me something about the organisation and what it does?
Absolutely. So City and Guilds is best known for its qualifications for plumbers or hairdressers, and that traditional side of City and Guilds has been around for over 100 years. In the last 10 years, it's actually really diversified. So now it does a lot more than qualifications. It does white-collar leadership and management assessments. It does executive coaching, e-learning and digital products.
Alan, as a CIO, from your experience in proactively presenting a business case, typically what are the buttons you need to press to get initial buy-in?
So City and Guilds Group is working in a commercial environment. So actually the metrics that we'll be looking for will be very common across a lot of industries. So they really focus around the financial. So is it revenue generating? Does it improve the profit margins? Or it'll be about customer experience and the actual mission of City and Guilds Group? Does it improve the outcomes for our learners or the benefits for our customers? Or is it more an internal operational efficiency type business case? And it could be a combination of any of those.
Simon, so what issues tend to be the big ones for the board in your experience?
I think they're very similar to what Alan's just described. They're very business-centric. They're all about what does the end client, end customer actually gain or benefit from, and also can you deliver operating efficiency out there that, again, the client or the customer can benefit from. I think the days of IT as a separate outward-looking organisation have gone. It's almost got to be looking inward through a different lens and presenting it back that way.
So, Alan, what type of business case would an IT department like yours want to present to senior stakeholders? What sort of things are you looking at?
So the one that I've got uppermost in my mind, because it's the work we've been doing with Ensono, is moving our big SAP student database into Azure from an on-premise data centre, which actually sounds very much like an infrastructure type activity. But within that, you've got benefits financially. So we'll save over £1 million per annum compared to our previous costs. But there's benefits for customers in terms of we can scale more easily our educational services globally when we're working out of a public cloud infrastructure. And finally, actually the innovation that you get with public cloud in terms of the analytics enable us to really understand where customers are getting success out of engaging with our online portals and products.
Simon, in your experience working across a broad range of industries with different clients, either as a CIO as a service or as a CIO advisor, are Alan's examples very typical? What other areas might be considered worthy of presenting as a business case?
I think they are typical. They are, as I said, very much internal. The IT department looking at things through a business lens. But one of the keys, and I think it's actually not necessarily even a weakness of IT, it's a weakness of organisations in general, is we all tend to be slightly inward-looking. We tend to look at how could we deliver operational efficiency compared to how maybe we operated last year by adopting a technology solution. How can we maybe reach new customers compared to how we reached new customers last year? And part of the problem with this is we're not looking outside. I think IT needs to be a lot smarter at looking at the marketplace, the broader marketplace that's out there, and almost doing a market analysis so that what we're actually looking at is a business case in the context of the industry that we're in, rather than necessarily a business case in the sense of the organisation that we are. Getting IT to actually engage in that process, given this quite often a traditionally slightly inward-looking organisation, I think can be quite challenging. But the more people can drive down that line, then the more efficient that business case will become.
So, Alan, picking up from what Simon was saying there, do you think that reflecting on, I suppose, the overall company vision and purpose as a sort of core, but looking at it within that wider market context is useful? Do you find yourself having to be very mindful of the overall strategy of your organisation?
I mean, that's really the starting point. So we want to be global leaders in skills development, and that really, you have to relate back everything we do into how it's going to help City and Guilds Group achieve its mission in terms of business cases. But I think where Simon's right is increasingly you're looking over your shoulder and saying, oh, well, are we disrupting or are we going to be disrupted? And if you only look within your own sector and your own industry, you're not necessarily going to spot those trends which might be disruptors of the future. So there's a fair amount of also let's learn from other industries and other sectors, research analysts and partners like Ensono and their new acquisition Inframon. What can they teach us? What can we learn from them that will help us in our business?
Simon, just shifting gears slightly, how do you present often very technical matters in a non-technical way to get the buy-in of other stakeholders within a business?
The short answer is you don't. But it's actually, in some respects, I think it's easier these days because technological capability, not necessarily the nuts and bolts, the bits and bytes, but what technology is capable of is a far more democratic. I think there's a greater democratisation of technology awareness, so that actually when you try and explain to people the capabilities of technology, there is less pushback. People aren't now going to say, well, actually, I don't think that is true. I don't think you can achieve that with technology. It's almost the other way around in some respects, that a lot of boards are perhaps slightly optimistic about what you can attain with technology. And the driver sometimes is almost going back to the IT department to deliver against those expectations. So it's about finding that North Star that Alan's referring to, finding the vision statement or the mission statement, and making sure that everything you do plays into that. And if you can find ways of accelerating or leading that journey for the business, then they're less concerned about how you do it with the technology, because we're in a world where pretty much at the moment everything is possible.
Alan, does that chime with you? Do you find that the expectations are very high on you and your team and what is possible? And how do you navigate your way through that?
I think the interesting thing with business case development in particular is you're looking at a board as a set of stakeholders. So by the time the actual decision and the approval is being sought, actually the decision should be already made. By the FD will have a real focus on, is it reducing costs or increasing income? The managing director of a business unit will want to understand how does it improve their customer experience. And all those conversations go on beforehand in terms of socialising the business case and getting them to a level of understanding. So when the sort of official approval document circulates, it's almost a formality.
Alan, when you are presenting one of these business cases, you've gone away, you've done your research, you think you found the right solution, the right way forward, and you're a little bit in sales mode, if you like. Do you also reflect some of the risks involved to other stakeholders? Is that something you would highlight?
Yeah, I think most organisations' business case process will have a risks section, and there will be inherent in any change the risks of actually what happens if it goes wrong, financially, operationally, and in terms of customer service. But equally, there's the opportunity risk. There is, what if we don't change? I mean, in the example of us moving from private cloud to public cloud, there was an opportunity to stay with a private cloud arrangement for a further 5 years, and that would have been perfectly acceptable. It wouldn't have been a bad answer at all for City and Guilds Group, but actually we wouldn't have been able to take advantage of all the innovation and analytics you get from public cloud platforms that more or less plug or play.
Simon, so you're presenting to a group as a CIO. How do you cope with blockers? Have you got any advice or strategy that you can share for getting around them?
I think Alan's approach is absolutely right. It's about socialising the ideas in the first place. So actually, by the time you come to present, you haven't got the blockers. And you can deal with the blockers almost on a one-to-one basis because you can address their particular needs, which then means it doesn't escalate into a much wider conversation. And I think that's one of the keys these days of, if you like, the new breed of CIO is this notion of socialising, because let's face it, IT and socialising have never really sat that well in sentences together. But it's become a much more of an interpersonal role where by speaking to people individually, by addressing their needs and explaining actually, yes, there are risks, yes, there are potential downsides to what you're doing, but there's a greater upside to it. It is the most effective way of doing that. I think if you ever get to the point where you rock up in the boardroom and you've got the final presentation, which, again, as Alan said, should almost be a rubber stamp, not without challenge, but there should be less of those conversations. If you're still facing blockers, then I think you haven't really done the job right in the first place.
Alan, how much time do you spend with other departments not strictly related to your department within your group?
A lot, actually. Both other departments internally, but also externally. City and Guilds Group is made up of these different types of organisations. So executive coaching is actually quite different from e-learning. And mixing with all the MDs is a delight in a way, because they've all got their different perspectives and different priorities. And there's a bit where you look at it and say, well, actually, how much is executive coaching enabled by technology? Well, to an extent, but really it's a face-to-face activity. Whereas e-learning clearly is fundamentally a digital business. So it's a quite different type of engagement. So there's the actual engagement with the MDs within the business, but we also invest in startups, early revenue companies, which are a real joy to mix with, and get that innovative spirit and bring some of that back within the group.
Simon, when you're working as a sort of CIO as a service or advising CIOs, do you spend much time with people outside of the IT environment within an organisation?
I think that depends on the organisation. In some organisations, CIOs are very switched on to the notion of spending time with other people. In some, they're not. They've almost never done the work before. And one of the areas I encourage is not only going around and spending time with the executives, but actually going around and spending time on the floor, if you like, with the end users, with the people who are consuming the technology. Because with the best will in the world, most managers, directors don't fully understand what happens day to day, even though they potentially were once there. That gets lost in the midst of time. Spending that time, getting that feedback, and then putting that into a loop is really, really important. And to be honest, I probably spend more time doing that than I do necessarily speaking to the business leaders across the business, because I very much see that as the CIO's role.
Alan, without sort of naming names, can you give me any examples of successful and less successful business cases that you have put forward in your career as a CIO, and how have they panned out, and what have you learned from those?
Sure. So on the more successful side, by the time you've done 2 or 3 iterations of a business case and start to see how the financials stack up and the risks versus the opportunities, you get a good feel for is this going to be viable or not? And actually, in many cases, that's sufficient for you to know whether to run with that business case. Or actually, it's maybe not such an urgent priority for the business as maybe its sponsor first thought. If it's not going to stack up and really deliver tangible benefits that people can see how they'll be realised, in the modern world, it's probably not going to go very far. The business case we're doing currently, moving SAP to Azure, has been very successful. In my last role, we did a big flexible and mobile working for care workers using different technologies. That was very successful. In terms of the aspects that haven't worked out so well, you might say you're going to save X amount of money, but if you can't show the tangible actions that need to be taken to deliver those savings, I think that's where a healthy scepticism comes in on behalf of your board colleagues and your finance director. They will ask questions. And if you haven't got the answers, that's probably where you're going to trip up.
Have you ever dropped a business case that you were pretty passionate about because having been through the due diligence and the process that you've just described, it becomes apparent that actually that change is not the right thing?
Yes, and it's I try to drop them as early as possible. So there's nothing wrong with exploring ideas and trying out business cases and start some initial research to look at the costs and benefits. And it's almost dodging a bullet. If you take a business case too far that really isn't going to fly, then there's a lot of people's effort goes into that, which could have been spent on something that's more beneficial to the organisation. But actually, there are some where I think there's almost like you need to be a bit brave, a bit of a pioneer, and say, I am going to stick my neck out. I'm not sure this is going to fly, but I think this is the right answer for this organisation, and I'm going to take it forward. Some of those you win, some you lose. I think actually those ones, because they're driven by a fire in your belly, those are the ones you're probably going to win on, because you will put all the effort into it to make sure the thing stacks up.
Simon, what about your experience being part of putting business cases forward? Any insights on some of the experience that you've had?
I think one of the important things is educating people these days that you quite often don't get a fully baked business case. You're never going to have 100% of the information. You're not going to have everything you need to make that decision. There's the great old quote from Mr. Bezos that says, if you need more than 70% of the information to make a decision, then you're probably going to be too late making the decision. And it's finding that balance in there, especially with, dare I say, slightly more traditional boards. It's not about taking a risk. It's not about taking a punt, but it's about having an iterative approach. So you've got a headline business case, and then you can build up to it with the information. But there will be a decision-making point that is probably precedes all of the available information, all the available risks, where you're going to have a red light or a green light before you actually go ahead. And that education process, I think, is as important as actually getting the business case in front of people. It's that change in in process needs to go on across the board and across their mind, and they have to have a huge degree of faith in you as a CIO that you're making that call on less information than perhaps they've historically had from you. Because let's face it, I think IT traditionally has gone in with a big bang, really detailed, once a year I need a budget refresh approach, and then suddenly we're going to be going back iteratively, potentially every couple of months, with new ideas, small additions, small changes that actually add up to something bigger. And then there isn't necessarily that perfectly crafted end state that we're aiming at, because I don't think that end state exists anyway.
Well, I do think, just to pick up, because I think it's a really strong point Simon makes, and I see it in many organisations that I talk to, where they do try and do what you might call an outline business case with rough order of magnitude, sums made without real definition behind it, to get a feel for whether the appetite's there. And actually that is a far more agile way of working, and you can get a feel for, yes, based on that outline business case, we're happy to proceed with more detail on one aspect, or we're happy to go ahead anyway on a different aspect without further information. So I think that two-stage approach to viewing investments is important. I think the other bit, which I've seen also work very well, is organisations that take a more traditional approach, where their investment budget is described line by line for the entire year ahead, which is effectively 18 months if they're on an annual budget cycle, doesn't leave much room for innovation, actually, because things change, things come along, and a lot of the innovative ideas just need a small pot of money to try them out. So I think organisations that set aside some budgets that isn't earmarked for a particular investment or another, but is just there, that can be called upon in a bid way, in like a Dragon's Den way, it also helps that whole process.
On that note, Alan, do you think in this very fast-changing IT landscape, do you think the role of a CIO is better or worse than before? It's clearly changing.
I think CIOs, when the role was first created in that way, was like more of an IT director, somebody who could talk a bit of business, And then we had the whole idea of chief digital officers coming along, the chief data officers, and these other increasing roles across the business. There's been a period where there's been a sort of actually which one should be the more senior role, who should report to who. Which one's the most important, all this type of thing. The role of the CIO now is changing into, actually, if you're in a marketing conversation, you've got to be the customer-focused like a CMO. If you're talking about operations, you've got to be able to talk like a COO. And if you're talking with your finance director, you've got to be talking like a CFO. So you've got to almost have all facets in a CIO role these days to be successful. And I think then what is happening across the industry, what we're seeing is it's almost like a magnetic effect. If people can cover all the bases, then organisations are pulling back technology onto more or less one or two roles rather than spreading it out as a trend was for the last few years.
Simon, your view in terms of the definition of a CIO today, what would that be?
It's less of a technology role. So, yeah, Alan's absolutely right. It used to be the IT director. It actually used to have IT in it. The fact that, in a way, the T bit doesn't actually sit inside the CIO job title is a bit of a giveaway. And I've always been a subscriber to actually IT is all about information with just a little bit of technology helping you along. And that, again, is really important. It's almost a visionary role. And I think this notion of innovation is really, really important in there as well, that trying to persuade a CIO that they have to have that vision for a year or 18 months is absolutely ludicrous. But the CIO now has to have the confidence to say, actually, no, I don't understand. I don't know what's going to happen in a year's time, because ultimately I don't think any of us do. And change is so radical and so fast that we need to be ready to embrace it. So they need to be very agile, very creative, very forward-looking and very prepared to change, which if you play that back against how you would have described an IT director probably only 5 years ago, that's almost a complete set of antonyms for where we were before. So I think the role has completely changed around. And the personality and the type of people that are in there now and going to be successful at it are utterly different to where they were 4 or 5 years ago.
It sounds like a fun role, Alan. Is that fair?
It depends on your idea of fun. So, my idea of fun is hard work that brings a result. So, while you're doing the hard work, it can be pressured. But if you get to the end of a 2 or 3 year transformation and you can really see a massive difference in how an organisation operates and delivers for its customers, then that to me is fun. That's really worthwhile. So the other thing I think as a CIO you have to make a judgment on, because it's not always written down, is where a business is at in its market position. So if it's going through a breakaway growth, actually the business case almost gets in the way and people just want you to get on with it and deliver for the business. Whereas if an organisation is sort of struggling to maintain competitiveness, then it's going to get far more cautious about new investments and you're going to have to work a lot harder to really demonstrate those benefits. Whereas if its outlook is fighting for survival, then it's going to be really tough to get investments through, however good the business case. So I think there is a bit of understanding where your organisation is at in its business cycle, as well as understanding the merits of a particular change in the business you'd like to see.
Simon, any final words in terms of getting a business case across the line?
I think one of the things that's really important, because the changing role of the CIO is, and I'm known for being quite passionate about this, is that I think lots of other elements of the board have external advice. It's like the CEO has the non-execs, the finance director has the auditors, the marketing department quite often has external advisors. The CIO actually now, I think, needs to be not afraid, perhaps, of calling on some external advice where they need it as well, and engaging not with one person necessarily, but with a range of experts. And whereas I think in IT, maybe asking questions has been seen as a little bit of a weakness, actually I think we now need to see that as a strength. And embracing that and driving that forward makes everybody slightly more complete in that sense, and helps mitigate some of the risk by getting some of that real external expertise through the door. So I think that's my message that's out there. This is a massive changing role, and some people have gone through it really, really successfully. And if people think they're struggling, then actually don't be afraid to ask for help from the experts. It's a really good idea.
Alan, is that something that chimes with you and the way that you work?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's so many questions arise. So there's almost an intuitive thing you've got to understand when I can listen to my own IT guys. I can maybe talk to some key partners, or I might need to get advice above and beyond that also. You know, if you're putting forward a very big business case, I think it is very wise to have some external side of that, whether it's benchmarking costs or actual trends within the industry or the technology decisions you're making. So I think absolutely always be prepared to learn would be my advice.
Well, thanks very much, Alan. And that is, in fact, all we have time for in this edition. So thanks to our guests, Alan Crawford and Simon Ratcliffe, discussing how to make a really good IT business case, as well as discussing some of the pitfalls. I hope you found it both entertaining and useful. And if you'd like to find out more about Ensono or any of the topics discussed today, go to ensono.com/UK. Don't forget to join us for future editions, and until then, goodbye.